Evidence Support Files ESF4 Normal versus Exponential. We continue our series of presentations focusing on individual points to a level that is sufficiently clear and basic as to support court cases as required. Note to censors, we use only government data. If you have a problem with the results, speak to the government. We continue with the exponential to illustrate the key topic of humped curves and the normal curve, aka normal distribution. In this presentation we discuss the normal curve. Again, we'll start with the Ferguson chart. It's not perfectly normal, though interestingly it's perfectly normal to peak, but slightly asymmetric, more of which are on and on. It's close enough, however, that it should look familiar. I'm sure you've seen charts like this before. There is a reason it's called the normal distribution. It's everywhere. Do a search on examples of normal distribution and Bing comes up with height, rolling dice, IQ, technical, stock market. Do a search on Wiki and you'll find an excellent article which is almost entirely useless for our purposes. We will use some of the basic features of a normal distribution in due course, but we'll introduce it rather differently. What's important for us is the shape of the curve. As William Farr, 1840, noted, it's a good fit for contagions. We were directed to Farr after making a similar observation. Hubei, a province in China, was the worst hit province by a factor of 50 to 100, even over its neighbours. It wasn't lockdown but blockade that proved extremely effective, a strategy nowhere else effectively implemented. Strange. Nevertheless, we generated this chart looking at Hubei cases and deaths, and it was the first time we experimented with a normal curve to fit the data. This is an important topic for later, auto-fitting normals to contagion data. For now it was clear that the fit wasn't unreasonable given the inevitable wobbly nature of real-world data. For South Korea, fitting the normal and log normal to the 3-day average was sublime, an excellent fit with a loose tail at low figures, which is of no particular concern. The log normal fit is so perfect, the actual data obscures the pink log normal for substantial parts of its curve. Clearly normal and log normal can be excellent candidates for fitting contagions. Nor is that an anomaly with COVID. Data for Ebola, Sierra Leone, and districts demonstrated further excellent fits. Here's Sierra Leone overall. Kenema, again with an excellent fit and a divergence at the tail at low levels. Western area rural, another fit so perfect it's an art form, again with that loose tail at low levels. Trying to suggest that normal isn't a good fit for contagions is absurd. The normal curve is not an official contagion curve, despite Farr's observation, but the logistic curve is, which is a cousin of the normal curve. Likewise log normal, Gompers, Richards, sigmoid are all variants and families of humped curves. Ultimately, however, the normal curve recommends itself because it really is a good fit many times, as noted. It is readily supported in Excel, which is convenient. Its symmetry highlights any asymmetry in the data. It lends itself readily to autofit, an important consideration when tracking over 200 countries' data, and perhaps most tellingly, though this may not be familiar, it is a close cousin of the exponential curve. One more reason, which derives from E and which we'll disclose in a moment. Here are two curves with one tiny difference. One of them is exponential. Can you tell which one from looking at it? Hint, it's not necessarily the biggest one. I could have used a greater than exponential accelerant. So which one? Here is how you can be lied to, but lacking a background in data analysis or, God forbid, trusting politicians and scientists, you would never know. Orange is exponential. Green is normal. Green doesn't look normal. It's not humped yet. It's too early. What then are we looking at? Conceptually, we're looking at the orange box highlighted. Here it's illustrating two normal curves accelerating upwards very similarly to exponential curves, but they're not exponential curves. In practice, we were looking at the highlighted box here, where we have an exponential orange and normal green curve. We limited the chart to 20,000, which comfortably shows the peak normal cases and the classic case shape of the normal curve. Now, do you know mathematically how to tell the difference between those curves? Show me the original pair just inside the orange highlighted box and I'd have to ask for the data to test or figure the data from the axes. Of course, if you've watched our previous videos, you know a much simpler test, so let's illustrate that here. Exponential is a straight climbing line on log scales. So let's switch to log scales. That's a beautiful chart. We've lost the characteristic tailed normal, and now we just have a straight line, g exponential, and a perfect dome, which I'm tempted to call a parabola. Maybe it is, someday I'll work it out, but not today. This chart has a lot to tell us. Firstly, it reinforces our point that attempting to read a climbing curve on linear scales is fraught with confusion. Is it exponential or normal? You can't tell without checking the data. Switch to log scales, however, as here, and the distinction is obvious. Exponential is a straight climbing line, normal a declining line, curling over in a dome back down. As soon as you see that declining curl over, the crisis is over. It's normal. So if you want to exaggerate a threat and hide the declining nature of the threat, use linear scales. If you want to show a simple and appropriate measure of the threat, use log scales. On log scales, as soon as you see that declining curve, you know that ball isn't going to reach the moon. The contagion isn't going to overwhelm the nation. It's normal. You can project the curve. That, by the way, is a key concept, that while a straight line goes to infinity, a curve, especially a cumulative curve, not shown, this is dailies, can readily be projected. We'll touch on that anon. As to COVID, it was falling away immediately everywhere you looked, but somehow the government and some scientists forgot to mention that. On linear scales you can get away with it, not on log scales. The second thing to note is that the very act of falling away, not flattening the curve, a government initiative, but the natural hump of that parabolic dome, we call curl over. Once you see a contagion falling away from that straight climb, you know you have a normal contagion, not exponential. Humped, not climbing to heaven. Dying out already. And that's the next thing to notice. What is the one tiny difference between the two curves, yet which is enough to condemn an exponential to infinity curve to a humdrum suborbital trajectory? Look at the F number. Each day we multiply the prior day's growth by the F number. For the exponential, F equals 1, so the next day's growth is the same as the previous day's growth. But for the normal curve, G0 for day 1 equals 1.15. On day 1, C equals 1, G equals 1.15, F equals 0.999. We can adjust the growth before or after, it's a matter of taste, but let's do after and use the previous day's values to get today's values. On day 1 we have C1 equals 1, G1 equals 1.15, F equals 0.999. So day 2, C2 equals C1 times G1 equals 1 times 1.15. G2 equals G1 times F equals 1.15 times 0.999, which comes out at 1.14885. So the growth rate on day 1 is 1.15 and the growth rate on day 2 is 1.4885. Not much difference. Seriously, that's a thousandth difference. Nothing. Tiny. Yet it's enough applied day by day to turn that exponential climb to a fall. On the 19th of July, day 141, the normal curve peaks out at 18,000 cases per day. On that day, the exponential curve is pushing out 315 million cases per day, 17,000 times more. The normal curve has peaked at 743,000 cases. The exponential curve is at 2.4 billion cases, over 3,000 times more. Now imagine if politicians sold you that exponential threat, but failed to mention that tiny 1,000th part deceleration per day, exaggerating 3,000 times, 16,000 times. Honestly, they're honestly. How many times have you been sold exponential, and what was the shape of the curves in the previous video of every contagion out there for which data exists? Exponential versus normal, the biggest, most fundamental lie and fraud. And 0.999 is an incredibly slight decline in growth. More realistic and common in COVID charts is 0.985. Here's each day's growth reduced by multiplying by 0.985 each day. Wow. Where'd he go? Where'd who go? Name that film. But damn, that's still keeping 99% of the growth, 98.5% of the growth, from one day to the next. But the curve just disappeared. The whole contagion was over before the end of March. Recall South Korea and its tight contagion quickly over. That had a decline factor of 0.97 from memory. We could work it out, but we won't be far out. If you've been sold exponential contagions when they were normal all along, then the exaggeration factors are in the thousands more. And of course, we're talking a completely different dynamic. How many times have you heard R0 being discussed, loosely the equivalent of RG? And how many times have you heard the F word? Well, the other F word, the growth decline factor. It doesn't exist, not in mainstream science. Maybe somewhere out there is a scientist who, like me, cares about the rate of change of R, equivalent to the rate of change of G. But I haven't heard any such discussion, have you? This is the most important concept in tracking COVID-19, and yet nobody even recognizes it. It is also intimately tied in with the normal curve. Simply put, C, G, and F define a normal curve. They define a normal contagion. All the time that politicians are doing voodoo with R0, they could simply be working with C, G, and F and the real-world data, because unlike R0, C, G, and F are right there, revealed every day by simple arithmetic. If cases today are 110, yesterday 100, that's G equals 10% or 1.1, 110 over 100. If cases tomorrow are 120, then G is now 120 over 110 or 1.090909. We'll call it 1.09. So G has gone from 1.1 to 1.09. So F, the decline in G, is 1.09 over 1.1. It's 0.991 approximately. The accurate figure is 0.991736. That's absurdly simple arithmetic, and yet it is measuring literally the defining quality of the contagion. And although people associate the normal distribution with probability, that's irrelevant. Swapping back to the 0.999 curve, what's important is this. That is a very smooth and plausible trajectory, and it's defined by a simple, constant rate of decline in the growth rate, and that's a normal curve. Who knew? When we discuss normal distributions, we think in terms of mean, standard deviation, and a resultant probability. We do in fact use those for autofit normals, but they're not the core. This isn't about probability, it's about growth and growth rates. What could be more natural than to say that a contagion has a slightly tougher time each day? Maybe it has to travel a little further as it spreads. Maybe it's had the easy wins. Who knows? That's for scientists, if there are any left. All we need to note is that normal is a very natural curve. It's a curve where every day it gets a little bit harder to spread. Every day growth declines by a tiny fraction, and that is the definition of a normal curve. We had no idea that was the case. We kind of backed into it, plotting the growth decay, noticing it was pretty linear on log scales, noticing that in fact the normal fit figures had that constant rate of decay. Could that be real? It turns out it is. As such, you can define a normal curve as a mean, standard deviation, a scaling factor, 1 for probabilities, or you can define a normal curve as an initial value, an initial growth rate, and the growth decline factor. It's the same thing. Both are useful, both conceptually and practically, but here and for now, the critical concept is the CGF form, A normal contagion has growth rates decaying from day one. And what do politicians claim? Lockdown is working, growth rate is reducing. Excuse me? The growth rate is reducing from day one. That is what those humped curves signify. Lockdown didn't do that. That's another consequence of the deliberate ignorance of the politicians, scientists and media. They get to claim success for something that was happening anyway. But that's for another day. We use the normal curve because it's convenient, accurate and powerful. We use log scales and curl over to detect and demonstrate that a contagion is normal, not exponential. And then we sit back and watch as politicians and scientists lie to the public and the public and media eat it up. It's just simple arithmetic, but it seems nobody's paying attention or wants to know. That's it for now. I'm Andrew Mather, a 60-year-old Brit, mathematician, financier, technologist, husband, biker, pilot, healer, whatever. Feel free to get in touch, andrew@peerlessreads.com or andrew@amather.com. Either should get to me.